Welcome to the All In podcast. Jay, thank you so much for being here.
Natalie, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm going to have to work through. I've got a little bit of a cold this morning, so we're going to have to work through that a little bit. But excited to be here, excited to have this conversation. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no, super appreciate you coming on, working through the cold and talking about some really important topics for athletes and just anybody who wants to perform at a high level in their job, in their life, in their family, in their sports. So could you give me a little bit of a background about what you do, your business and stuff like that before we dive right into it?
Yeah, no, great question. So came out here to Denver, 2014, pursuing a graduate degree in high performance and sports psychology. So finished that up. From there, spent a couple of years down at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, working with those athletes. And that was actually in preparation for 2016 Rio. So while getting the degree, was able to have that experience down there, which was pretty transformative. And then from there, after that contract was fulfilled, kind of had this moment, and there was one specific client that I had worked with who, a young female figure skater. She was at the national team level, not of this country. But she was incredibly talented. And because of that talent, her sport had thrust her up through the ranks in her country quite quickly. And she was incredibly physically gifted, had all the physical tools, technically incredible, very tactically sound, but nobody ever taught her what was going to happen when the lights came on. And that kind of pressure, which I know is what we're going to get into today, but the amount of pressure that she felt, and it got to a point where she would just emotionally break down before she would even go on. And it got to a point where she couldn't even take the ice. And so worked with her. And this was at the time she was 13 when we started working together. And it took a lot of work, and all the credit goes to her. But we were able to kind of move her through that mental block and get her back to a place where she could continue pursuing her career without the burden of that mental challenge anymore. And that really kind of, flipped a switch for me. I was kind of at this crossroads. Do I continue trying to work with these high level athletes, Olympians, professionals? Do I go into a college athletic department? And I had this sneaking suspicion that the work that we were doing with these incredibly high level athletes would actually probably be better used or better utilized if we could give it to these younger developing athletes. Because for all the athletes that I had worked with to that point that had made it to that level, the thought that I had was, how many hadn't made it to that level, not for lack of physical or technical gifts, but just truly because they found themselves one day in the face of a mental challenge that they just didn't have the resources to overcome. So that led to, starting the practice out here in Denver. And I've been doing that this will be the 5th full year of doing that, and just started putting some stuff out there online, creating some content, putting, what's been proven to work with the developing athletes that I've been working with for the last 5 years, and trying to make those resources more readily available to other developing athletes as well as their parents. So that's kind of the long of the short of it.
I love that. That's super cool. Amazing what you were able to do for that young athlete, but also equally amazing that you have that mission to help those younger generation of athletes get to that level. Because I've seen the same thing, right? Whether it's a mental game, but also it's, the financial part, the support part. It's in that middle level of you have all the talent and you're trying to make that jump to the highest level. That's where you see the big fall off in athletes. And there's the big wondering of what if they had that support? What if they were taught, the right things the right way? Could they have made it and become some of the best in the world if they were able to get through that? I'm curious to see what your process is when you're teaching someone from the basics when it comes to mental performance versus someone who, they've already had some experience and maybe they have to relearn things or they're going through a hump. I'm sure that it's probably easier to go with someone who just hasn't learned about it at all and just build that basics rather than someone who might have, a misunderstanding and having to flip that switch.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually. I mean, and even for me, while I do have a focus on developing athletes, I've got several professionals. I've got 2 or 3, for example, pro women's soccer players that I work with. And so obviously the work with them is fundamentally different than the work that I do with my 10-year-old baseball player that I have right now, or the couple 14-year-old hockey players that I work with. And so, yeah, I think Generally there's really no cookie cutter approach with this. And I don't ever take that approach when it comes to the mental side of sport, because across all the sports, the demands can be so different. But then also you have to match those demands to what are the needs of the individual person. And so there's really no cookie cutter approach, but from a philosophical standpoint, I always start with mindset. And I get that at this point, in our world, mindset's kind of become like that cliche, buzzword that gets a lot of social media likes and shares. But at its core, very simply, a mindset is really just nothing more than the patterned way that we think. It's our thought habits. And every single athlete that I work with, even you as an athlete, we all have habits in given situations. So for example, a young athlete who's facing stress or a pressure-filled situation, generally they have a patterned way that they think about or that they handle that situation. Now the question becomes, are those thought patterns, is that productive? Are they productive or are they unproductive? And in that process, obviously is very unique to each individual, but that's where we always start. So with a young athlete or with a professional athlete, we're always having conversations, or we're doing a variety of different exercises or self-awareness raising activities, or really just conversations, trying to help them understand what their mindset is. Because the line that I use with every single athlete is it doesn't really do any good for me to understand what's going on with you, right? It's my job to really help them understand themselves, help them understand what makes them tick. How do they think? What are some of these underlying thought patterns? And then from there, once we identify what is going on that's unproductive from just a pattern thought standpoint, then we start to work to correct those things. And then once from there, then we start getting into more of those mental skills and the pre-performance routines. But for me, everything starts with the mindset.
I love that. And I totally believe that is so true, that everything starts with the mindset, and regardless if it is mental performance training or anything else in life, really. And I'm curious, before we dive into talking about, pressure and dealing with pressure, you mentioned that mindset has become such a buzzword now, and it's totally true. But I think, for good reason, because for so long we forgot that our mindset, mental health, mental performance, those were things we just didn't talk about or didn't hear about. It was all about the physical. And this is not just in sports, but it's with everything, whether it's someone who wants to become, a better father, or someone who wants to be better in their business. Everything was about like the output, the work, the results, and not the mindset. So I'm so happy to see that that's being, shone a light on and being prioritized. Why do you think that it wasn't as prioritized before, or was kind of left behind in priorities before? And why do you think now it's starting to come up and obviously become such a big buzzword?
Yeah, I think you and I are very much aligned in that. And when I say buzzword, I don't, mean to disregard, because mindset is obviously, as you said, incredibly important. I think you see a lot of quotes that maybe mislead kind of what a mindset is, or we overuse the word. And I think that's my concern, is I don't want that word to become overused or just thrown out into everything to where then now all of a sudden it's diminished in value. But to answer your question, I would say there's always been a stigma with psychology. And even, I've been doing this for, in private practice now for 5 years. And I remember when I, started, really got started back in 2016, it absolutely, it's been stigmatized. There was such a stigma, or, a great example is, I'd have an athlete come to me, and if they were struggling with the mental side of their sport, they wouldn't look at it the same way as if they struggled in one of the other 3 areas of their athletic development, right? So for an athlete to develop, there's really 4 core areas: physical, technical, tactical, and mental. If they struggled physically, they wouldn't think that there's necessarily something wrong with them at their core. They would just say, I need to go get in the weight room, right? If they had a struggle with a technique, I just need to go get in the gym, or go rep it out a little bit more, or just go practice more. If there's a tactical struggle, well, I just need to go watch more film, or I need to go, I'll go watch some pros do it. If I struggle, but then, so that would be kind of the baseline, but then they would get to, well, I really can't handle stress, or I'm having a hard time managing my emotions, or pressure is really getting to me. And there was something there where deep down you could sense, and even in the work that I did with them, you could sense that they felt that there's just something wrong with me at my core. And so I've gotten, for just out of practice and out of sheer necessity, really good at framing it up for these young athletes that, listen, you're not here because there's anything wrong with you, right? That would be like literally saying that because you can't squat 400 pounds as a 14-year-old, there's something wrong with you. If you want to squat 400 pounds, fantastic, but there's going to be a process in order for us to be able to get there. Likewise, if you want to be able to handle this kind of pressure that you're putting yourself in, or these pressure situations that you're finding yourself in, well, there's also a process to be able to get better at that. So I think just at a very high level, we don't necessarily look at it as the mental side at times as purely just a deficiency, maybe of a skill set or unproductive thought habits in terms of mindset. We'd love to take it deeper, or we've taken it so much deeper for such a long time in terms of judging ourselves at our core, is if there's something at times that's just intrinsically wrong with us because we just expect ourselves to be able to handle some of these things, when it's hard to expect yourself to be able to handle those things if you haven't put in the work to be able to earn that right. But we don't see it that way.
I absolutely love that perspective. I think that's so important for all athletes to hear, and anybody to hear, because it's not that you're all of a sudden struggling with something and you have to go seek out coaching. It's like anything else. If you look at mental health, mental performance, psychology, mindset, if you look at those and you put them at the same level as physical performance, which I think is what everyone is working to destigmatize and to bring awareness to, is that, mental performance, mental health, that is equal to physical health and physical performance, then you're going to treat it in the same way. And you're going to be able to build those skills through a coach like yourself or however else over time, and not look at it in the way of like, oh my gosh, now I have the yips, I need to go and get a coach, or now I'm dealing with, anxiety, depression. Now I need to go seek a therapist. These are things that we can be kind of proactive on and be getting coaching. And yeah, I think it just needs to be destigmatized. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that and spoke about that. Now let's dive into the whole concept of psychological pressure. We obviously saw, the Olympics were recently. That's kind of the big shining light for a lot of athletes. As an athlete watching it and thinking, wow, 4 years of work is going into this one very moment, and knowing how easy it is to have a bad weekend or just have a bad day, that concept of pressure is always top of mind. So I'd love for you to just kind of give an overview of the concept of psychological pressure, and then we can dive into what causes it, what to do about it, and how you can perform your best in the face of it.
No, that's a great place to start. And I think you hit the nail on the head in that, a lot of the conversation, or even really the research to this point about pressure has really been on the effects of pressure. Right? We're always very acutely aware, or much of the conversation is always geared toward what are the effects of pressure? How do they negatively impact our performance? And I think why I was so excited about this conversation is because we could actually get into where does it come from in the first place? Can we get to the root cause of that pressure? And, to start off with, pressure happens. This phenomenon known as psychological pressure happens when we feel as people as though our identity is threatened. Okay. So we got to unpack that a little bit. So an identity, your identity, Natalie, my identity, is really made up of two things. So Natalie Allport's identity is made up of two things. The first thing is, how does she perceive the world around her finds value in her? The second thing is, how do you value yourself? And that's the same for absolutely any person that's listening to this. Every single person, if you're a listener of this episode, your identity is made up of how you think the world around you values you, as well as maybe more impactfully, how you find value in yourself. Now, obviously, those two things can be very connected, right? Sometimes we sculpt our value, our internal value, or how we find value in ourselves based on how we perceive the world around us finds value in us. So that's identity. Pressure is going to happen when that identity is threatened, which means, so take a young athlete who, let's say a high school athlete who, we'll do a little case study here because I actually just took on a new client that would be a great example of this. So 16-year-old football player, stress fracture. I mean, he's always been incredibly athletic. Okay, 16-year-old football player, always been incredibly athletic. He's always been the fast kid. He's always been the one who's just super gifted, certainly works hard, but always also kind of had, just very naturally athletically gifted. Was always one that everybody said, this guy's going to go, he's going to be a Division I football player. He really has a potential future, like in the sport, this, that, and the other thing. Gets a stress fracture. Okay. Massive threat to his identity, because you think about how, for better or for worse, and again, we'll talk about, just that pressure in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you think about how much of this young high schooler's value, how much of how he has come to value himself based on maybe how the world around him has valued him. He's always been an athlete. Then he gets hurt. Stress fracture in his foot, and he's afraid of running hard, of getting re-injured. Now, most would say, well, obviously he's afraid of getting re-injured because of the pain, because of not wanting to go back through rehab. And that's certainly probably part of it. But the bigger thing here is he's afraid of getting hurt again, or he feels the pressure to perform, because if he gets hurt again, the thing that he identifies most with in this world is in his head going to be fundamentally stripped away and taken away from him. So that's why we feel pressure. Now, this is true for any person. If there's a parent watching this, parents wake up Monday morning, they probably feel a sense of pressure to be able to go out and perform in their job, because that helps them fulfill their role as a parent. So they have a big meeting, they have a big sales call, they have a big presentation to give. They're going to feel pressure to perform. So there's nothing inherently wrong with pressure. In fact, for an athlete such as yourself, or a lot of the high level athletes that I work with that really have come to really understand how to perform in the face of pressure, they don't look at pressure as a threat. Pressure is more merely a sign that this is a moment that I need to be in, that's meaningful and impactful to my life. But at a very high level, any person will feel the sensation or feel this, experience of psychological pressure when they feel as though, based on the results of the situation, that their value to the world around them, or the value that they hold to themselves, may be diminished based on the result that they get in that situation.
That is like the best explanation of what causes psychological pressure that I've ever heard. And that really summed up some of what I've been experiencing over the past 2 years, for example, when like my past in snowboarding, and how the whole identity piece and the mental health crises that I went to because of all these injuries I was going through, and how growing up, like everyone told me, like, you're going to be a really great athlete, you're born to be an athlete, blah, 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 blah. And then I transitioned into CrossFit, which just filled that same identity,
yes.
Right?
Yep.
Until 2 years ago, I had a motorbike crash, and I've been 2 years without being able to compete. And during those 2 years, I have spent so much time unpacking the identity piece and realizing, what am I doing this for? And returning to just doing things for the love of it. And so now I have this fire to, keep rehabbing, competes again once it's all ready to go. But I feel absolutely no pressure, and that pressure has been lifted in my business, in my content, like in all these things, because I've unpacked the identity piece that was so attached with the sporting results, the business results of this. And it was because I think, like you said, it's the value that we think that the world places on us, or that piece. And I think like you mentioned, when you get your own value of how you see yourself tied to that first point, it can really sway things, and you think that you're not enough, or you're not good enough, or whatever it is, until you match that value or that identity that you think other people have put on you. And so I really appreciate you sharing that, because that's huge.
Do you think that was like that experience, going through that experience, is what motivated you? Because obviously when I reached out to you, being an admirer of your work, raising, having these conversations on mental health as an athlete for athletes, do you think that was kind of the penultimate moment for you, saying, this, I went through this is why I need to be doing the work that I'm doing now?
Yeah, 100%. I did a TED Talk this year about failure and what I learned from not making the Olympics, and how the mindset that I had when I was snowboarding, if I would have made the Olympics, I would have got a gold. It just wouldn't have been enough, right? It's always the next thing. And it's because my identity was so tied to proving other people wrong, or, fulfilling this identity that I thought other people put on me, rather than just I'm a human being, not a human doing. I love sports. That's what I want to do. And so it's going to be interesting to see as, I'm still trying to figure out what's exactly wrong with my shoulder. I'm awaiting a last MRI. So there's a chance I might still need surgery after this 2 years already of rehab. But like, I am so motivated to, get back and see how competing would be like without that same feeling of pressure. Because when you go back, and people would always ask me, well, was it the system putting pressure on you? Was it your national team coaches? Was it this? I was like, it was me. Like, it was me putting pressure, but it was because of how I thought that I was perceived in that identity piece. So really appreciate you for kind of summarizing that much better than I could ever.
Well, no, and the reason that I asked that, I mean, it's an incredibly courageous thing, right? I mean, I work with athletes all the time, and just getting them to face, some of these hard realities of, and you think about, like, for you, even just kind of that internal dialogue and the internal self-talk that went on trying to navigate this process. And the reason that I asked that is, you would talk about the sensation of the pressure being lifted. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because once we start to recognize that we are, in fact, more than just what we do, for example, we may be a significant other, we may be a friend, we may be someone's child, we may be, somebody who partakes in certain hobbies and things like that. And once we start to invest or in your case, we're forced to invest in other areas of our life, now all of a sudden we recognize that that there is a space to do the thing that we love to do. And just because we don't feel pressure, we didn't feel like the pressure that we used to, that doesn't mean that we're any less motivated or we're any less passionate. Those two things are not, I can't even find the word here, but they're not exclusive to each other, right? It's not that you need to feel this tremendous amount of pressure in my entire identity and wrapped up in something, and only then do you care about what you do. That's not true at all. It's really this ability to, can you do the thing that you love to do? And you probably still are going to feel, I'll be honest with you, you're probably still going to feel some pressure when you're in those situations, but it's not going to be at the level that it used to be. And it's going to mean something else. And that's really where, when we think about, and when I work with my young athletes about how do we start to perform in the face of pressure, it starts with what's the relationship with pressure in the first place? Because the relationship that we want to get to is, obviously we're going to care. And obviously if we don't do as well as we want to be able to do, there's going to be a sense of disappointment, or we might be angry or frustrated, and that's okay. But that's fundamentally different, feeling just natural human emotions when we don't do as well as we want to do. That's completely okay. But allowing the result of a situation to completely assault the amount of worth that we have to ourselves or to the world around us is completely different. And so I think it's going to be interesting as you get back into, because you will, but as you get back into competition, to hear how that experience has changed for you in terms of the pressure, or what it is that you feel in that moment is more a sign of, okay, this is what I've been working for. This is a chance to celebrate all that hard work, to kind of steal a line from one of my favorite grad school professors, competition or performance is really just a chance to celebrate what it is that we're trying to do. And there's going to be a feeling behind that, but it's not going to be a threatening experience. It's going to be more this experience for you of, I'm in this moment because I choose to be, because I actually choose to be. Nobody else is nobody else is dragging me and tying me to this situation. So, I can't wait to hear how that goes.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to do it. I'm excited to kind of show people that, competing at the high level doesn't have to be a sacrifice to your mental health. And there's a healthier way to do it rather than constantly trying to seek this validation from your results or whatever it is. I have a kind of a cool example. So for people who are listening in from the time this podcast is out, 2 weeks prior, there's going to be a podcast out with one of my friends who in 2014, when I missed out on the Olympics, she was the one who ended up getting that spot and going to the Olympics. And she talked a lot about this identity piece. And I think she hinted at it without summarizing it as eloquently as you did, where she talked about she went to the Olympics, she got that spot, and every competition afterwards, it was like now she had this pressure to live up to that identity, that label of like, I went to the Olympics. I'm at this level now. I need to compete with these people. And so she would get really great in the qualifications for the events and then completely choke in finals over and over again. And then she went through years of injuries. And now she's been years off competition because she was injury after injury after injury and poor performance after poor performance, underperforming. And it was just so interesting to hear that, you know, regardless of how our journeys varied, where I missed the Olympics and that kind of veered my journey, she made the Olympics, but had that same experience where all of a sudden she had that label and felt like she had to live up to that label.
And we can get very tactical here, because what you're talking about is actually something that happens often for a lot of people when they start to feel pressure, or when they have kind of this relationship between identity and sense of self-worth and the thing that they're doing. In what happens is, in psychology, we call it a frame of reference. And a frame of reference is really how does an individual go about trying to determine if the thing that they're doing is the right thing, or if they're going about things in the right way. So, for example, in that situation, in your friend's example, what she's really suffering from is she's suffering from an external frame of reference, as if you were to, and obviously this is a podcast here, but I'm holding my hands up, but like as if there was a frame in front of you, and you're looking from the frame to the external world and trying to determine from the external world and trying to see, you know, does the external world, are they okay with what I'm doing effectively? And this, obviously, we're talking about this through the context of high level sport and what it is to be an athlete. But there's a lot of people that struggle with this. There's a lot of people that, you know, whether they want to admit it or not, maybe they're guilty of living their life with this external frame of reference, in that every single action that they take, they're looking to the world for validation or gratification or this sense of assurance. And that's what happens at times. That's one of the big things that happens at times with pressure, is the pressure and this identity. If we get caught up in kind of that, you know, that little hamster wheel in our head, now all of a sudden we have this, again, mindset, this habitual way of thinking, this thought pattern that says, I'm going to consistently continue to look to the external world. And is the external world saying that I'm good enough? Can I find enough of myself from the external world? What obviously we want to be able to do is we want to flip that on its head. We want to be able to turn that frame around and look inward and try and find, whether it's our belief system, our core values, how we were raised, you know, things like that, really value-driven action, and trying to say, is what I'm doing, is that true and authentic to me? And again, back to you and your example of, you're going to be returning to performance, you're going to be returning to, you know, competition and, you know, high level sport. But I think you're going to find that there's not going to be that external frame of reference as much. And you're going to recognize there's going to be this sense of self that's going to be so strong, because you're looking outward in. The frame of reference has turned around, and you're looking inward to yourself, and you're recognizing that I'm here for me. This is what I'm doing is true and authentic and loyal to myself. And I no longer need to look to, whether it's my teammates, my friends, my family, I don't need to look to the external world and judge myself based on, or my value based on how they value me.
Yes, I think that's so important. And it kind of made me think, like, especially with this example of, like, a lot of people, they love to resonate with the underdog story, right? And I have this argument with my boyfriend all the time, because we watch, say, the CrossFit Games or the Olympics or F1, for example, and he loves to cheer for, you know, the next person coming up. And I'm like, and then hate on the person who's winning over and over again. And of course, as a fan, you want to see new people and all these things, but I have such a respect always for the people who have managed to stay on top. And what I found is that the people who have early success, like the prodigies, as well as the people who managed to stay on top, I think just from understanding psychology that it's so difficult because the pressure that you have and from that early success or from trying to stay on top and everyone trying to take you down. I'd love for you to kind of go over maybe the differences of pressure that someone to try to stay on top or someone who had that early youth success has versus someone who they haven't achieved that yet. And so they're chasing, right? And that underdog story in a way sometimes can be easier to manage because you're like just on the way there.
It's interesting. And this is, I think there's a lot of people that, and there's even, from very early on in my career, when I was down at the training center, I met a lot of athletes that operated under that assumption of this has to be the entirety of who I am. This has to be, I have to fulfill this. I have to do this. And how do I say this? That can get you that mindset, even that mindset that you had, that mindset, because there's some people that may be listening to this being like, yeah, well, Natalie had that mindset and maybe it wasn't terribly productive at the time, but look how far it got you.
Right.
Here's the thing. There's a very hard ceiling, right? There is a ceiling on how much you're able to achieve. Now for Natalie, thank goodness that got her all the way to, as a Team Canada snowboarder. Fantastic. There's a lot of other people that they find that ceiling of the amount of pressure that they face much, much lower. And I'm here to tell you that ceiling is poured in concrete. There is no breaking through that ceiling on, that cap on your potential, on your ability to perform when you're faced with that much pressure. Because as you allude to, let's say somebody does make it, what keeps them going? If the entirety of their existence as an athlete was, I need to prove people wrong, I need to do this, I need to do that, because then I will find worth in myself. And as you alluded to, let's say that somebody somehow finds a way to win an Olympic gold or do really well. And then there's not this sense of relief because there's no space for that relief to exist within the person. And I think that's a really important thing for people to recognize, is that when you operate with that mindset, when you operate through the lens of what I do is everything that defines who I am, there's really no space for when you finally achieve, because you're not going to allow yourself to achieve. Because if there's nothing more, because quite simply, if there's nothing more for you to achieve, then what are you? And that's a big, 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 heavy question. And that's where, again, you even alluded to the struggle at times of transitioning out of the sport or getting away from it, or, even the individual who did achieve what everybody, what the majority of people in your sport want to achieve, of going to the Olympics. What's next? And sometimes we realize that there isn't anything next. And then there's this hole, then there's this gap of, well, how am I going to define my worth now?
Yeah. Wow. No, I absolutely love that. So how can we perform, or how can an athlete or anybody who's dealing with this psychological pressure, how can they perform their best in the face of it, or just flip that switch and flip that mindset?
Yeah. So the first thing, again, if we're going to start with the mindset, is we need to be able to find some balance. Now, this might be like in your situation, or like in the situation with my athlete where he got injured, it might be forced. We might be forced to find some balance here because we just can't get away from our sport. But especially for, obviously I work with a lot of like younger developing athletes, and for them specifically, it's a lot of work with the parents, because kids are very impressionable. And when a young athlete, a 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old, and let's say they're, I've had some who are incredibly good at baseball. Well, now all of a sudden, the parent, because they see their athletically gifted child, and the parent, not out of any malicious intent or anything like that, they just want to support the child to the best of their ability. So what do? Right? They get them on 2 or 3 different travel teams, and they go to all the showcases, and they get, 2 or 3 private coaches. But what ends up happening, or the subtextually what's happening there subconsciously for the athlete, is now all of a sudden it's very easy for this young athlete to start to see that, or start to think that, whether it's true or not, that the biggest piece of value that I have to my parents is thing that I'm doing in baseball, because it's what we talk about. It's what we spend all of our time doing. It's what we travel to go do. It's what, when it's what all my friends are tied up in baseball. Some of the most impactful people in my life are my coaches. They're also my baseball coaches. When grandpa and grandma come over for Thanksgiving dinner, they're asking me about baseball. So it's very easy all of a sudden for this young person to, just because there's a bit of conditioning going on here, to just start to fall into this mindset of my worth to the people around me is based on this thing that I do. So with younger athletes specifically, it's way more about the work with the parents and how do we balance that out? How can we become acutely aware of, like, if you think about it like a grade school pie chart, right? Think about the grade school pie chart with parents. I'd often ask, like, write down the percentage of time that you spend talking to, thinking about your child as this role of an athlete. And then I also want you to write down what percentage of time do you remind them that they're a child, that they're your son or daughter, that they're somebody's friend, that they're probably a sibling. How much, how much praise do you give for these other roles versus how much praise do you give your child for their role as an athlete, or the success that they have as an athlete versus the success that they have as a student, a brother, a friend, somebody's, grandchild, whatever it may be. And I think what parents' eyes kind of, get nice and big, like a cartoon character, because they're like, oh, shoot, we've really been conveying this message of sports and athletics. And again, I always operate under the assumption with parents is that they're doing what they're doing because they're trying to keep their child safe, in this case, keep their child safe from failure. And so they're going to do everything that they can to keep their child from failing. So they're going to throw every bit of resources that they can at the child. But at times, though, this can kind of be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because now the child feels just this tremendous amount of pressure, and now they're not able to perform. And then now they're looking around the world around them wondering, well, what are people going to think of me if I can't do this thing or be as good at this thing as I was before? So that's more on like the younger athlete side. Is a lot more of it has to do with the work with parents. Now, for older individuals, such as my pro, women's soccer player, it's truly like, it's some big, heavy conversations. Like, it truly is, what's driving this? Where does this come from? What are some of the, if we can get into what are some of the underlying thought patterns? What are some of the emotions that lie underneath this? And almost always it connects to this sense of shame. And shame is really nothing more than the fear of being unworthy. And those are hard. Those are big, heavy conversations. And at times that can lead to a lot of tears, but there can kind of be this sort of, not to sound super floofy here, but like there can be this sort of emotional kind of awakening, if that's what you want to call it, or this heightened state of emotional awareness around, wow, this is what's really been driving this for a long time. And then with the older individuals, it truly is a matter of, obviously you're a professional, you need to work hard, you need to continue doing what you're doing. But when it's time to stop being, in this case, a soccer player, what is it that you're doing? What is it that you're thinking about? Are you investing in other areas of your life? Are you investing in relationships outside of soccer? And it's ironic because this obviously isn't just contained to high level sport. There are individuals listening to this that, at one time in their life, they may have gotten too wrapped up in their career, right? They may have had a very demanding job. And because that job is so demanding, and maybe it's a very prestigious job, doctor, lawyer, whatever it may be, people see them as such. And so now what they do has become so much of who they are. And maybe we neglect some of the other relationships that quite literally we don't, whether they want to admit it or not, they don't hold as valuable, not because they don't think that those people are important, but because they don't perceive that the world around them finds value in them for those other relationships. So, the classic example is, career-driven man or career-driven woman, right? They're driven by their career because they perceive that the world around them values them for their career. Maybe not so much as a, father or mother, or as a spouse, or as somebody's friend, or whatever it may be. So it's something that applies certainly to high level athletes and performers. But, the message that I have to a lot of people is that in some way, shape, or form, we're all performers. We're all trying to achieve. We're all trying to move ourselves from the version that we are to the version of ourselves that we want to be. And we certainly should be at the same time striving to do that in the healthiest possible way, and making that thing the entirety of the value that we have to the world. There's going to be a hard cap on the amount of success or happiness or fulfillment that really anybody has in their life.
Such an important topic and such important advice. And I'm curious because I think it takes time to break that mindset, especially for example, the pro female soccer player that you have, probably for her, if she's always attached, with that external validation or whatever it is, it takes a lot of time. Like you have that breakthrough moment, but, in moments of pressure, for example, you might fall back into that same mindset. What can people do to like keep working on that? Is it just, attacking those subconscious thoughts and trying to be more aware of them and be more mindful of them and switching that narrative? How long does it take for someone to change that?
Well, how long it takes is really the classic, like it depends. And it truly does depend. I think I've had some people who it just clicks and then there can be like this big sense of relief. There are other people who, and we'll get to what kind of drives it. There are other people who are just very resistant to that change. And almost always, you make a great point in terms of, we don't have to get too theoretical here with it, but you make a great point of, is it being mindful of the thoughts or the thought patterns or that sort of thing? And in a way, yes, but thoughts to me and the work that I do with athletes aren't nearly as important as understanding the emotions that underpin those thoughts, because I think a lot of people operate under the philosophy that thoughts equal action. And that's not necessarily true. We have 70 to 80,000 thoughts in a day. We don't take action on the majority of them. The majority of them are like cars that, the metaphor that I use is you're driving down the interstate and there's probably tens of hundreds of thousands of cars that have passed you on the other side of the road, or that you're driving with on your side of the road. The majority of those thoughts we pay no attention to. We couldn't describe them. They have no bearing on our life. There are a few thoughts that really grab us though. Car in front of you stops short at a light, right? You almost rear end them. You experience then this emotion of fear, and then followed by maybe a little bit of anger. Like, what is this idiot doing stopping short in front of me? Well, you're going to remember that car. You're going to remember that car because it created an emotional experience for you. So yes, we need to be mindful of the thoughts and things like that. But what we really need to become acutely aware of is what are the emotions that underpin those thoughts, because it's the emotions that at times that can be the thing that dictates the action. We have, like I said, 70 to 80,000 thoughts in a day. We don't take action on the majority of them, but we do tend to at times, many people are, and even myself included, we as people can be guilty of taking actions on thoughts based on how they made us feel, right? So for example, maybe they made us afraid, or we were frustrated or angry, or we were worried or doubtful, or, we felt a little bit of shame, and that emotion then cause that individual to then take some sort of action, or move them to inaction, right? I think sometimes sometimes the most powerful effect of emotions can be the actions that we don't take, right? So individual sees an attractive potential significant other. They feel fear. They don't go approach that person and say hello. So that's kind of the hallmark example of that. So when it comes to, how do we start to move that person to change? It really is a lot of the work is truly rooted in what's the emotional experience that's going on here. How do those emotions at times dictate the actions that we take, whether that's a physical action or whether that's a mental action, in terms of how do those emotions dictate our thinking or dictate how we talk to ourselves in those situations. Once we can, again, raise a lot of awareness around that, then it becomes this process, this very consistent process that they need to be held accountable to, of you as a person are allowed to feel however it is that you need to feel. We as people, we are going to feel fear and worry and doubt and anger and shame. And that's okay. That is, emotions are kind of the texture that, that kind of give, life texture, right? There's not really a ton of life without emotion, right? And I think the majority of people spend a lot of time, or the majority of athletes spend a lot of time trying to beat back fear or beat back shame shame or beat back worry. And what they also do then is, because, as Brene Brown's work has been so tremendous, we can't selectively numb emotions. And so if somebody like my pro female soccer player, the example there is she spent so much time battling the fear and the worry and the doubt and the anger and the frustration that all of a sudden she woke up one day and there also wasn't a lot of space for happiness. There wasn't a lot of space for joy. There wasn't a lot of space for fulfillment or even to be excited about her sport. And that is in that, obviously, we did a lot of work on vulnerability and working through a lot of those things. So everything's connected. I think from a theme standpoint, though, yes, thoughts play a role, but thoughts are really only impactful based on the emotions. And can a person better understand how what they're feeling is trying to impact the actions or the inactions that they may take? And almost always, for any person, whether you're, doctor, lawyer, high level athlete, or, a high schooler trying to take a test, almost any time that we allow our emotions to impact what we do or what we don't do, that's almost always going to move us further away from a place of being able to be successful.
That's so important, because I think there's a lot of times where we forget about the whole fact of emotions. And in sports, there's kind of the old culture of coaching where it was like, emotions are nothing, who cares? They don't matter, right? And I think that couldn't be further from the truth when you have someone like you who mentors these young athletes, these pro athletes, and you talk so much about emotions and how they do affect us. So neglecting emotions would make no sense from a mental health standpoint, a psychological standpoint, a performance standpoint of just neglecting these emotions. So how can we separate ourselves from the emotions and, not let them impact us as much?
I think it goes back to step one is, how aware are you that they're even happening in the first place? And I think I would say that self-awareness is probably, of all of the mental skills out there that people get so excited about, I would say that self-awareness is probably the most underrated quality that a person can have, because it's the old cliche, you can't fix a problem unless you recognize that there is one. Well, you can't stop allowing the emotions to impact what you do or what you don't do unless you can recognize that they exist in the first place, and unless you can put, a name to what the emotions are. And really what happens then is, the great example is, have you ever met somebody, two examples of people who get really angry? Okay. We've all met that person who gets really, really angry, and they start taking a lot of actions out of that anger. Maybe they start yelling, or they start, throwing stuff, or they, whatever it is. Like it's just clear, or you can see that like they're just in their own head and they're completely shut down and reserved because they're incredibly angry. Compare and contrast that to somebody, maybe a parent, right, who kiddo messed up, and the parent says, instead of just yelling and throwing a tantrum, the parent identifies and says, you know what, I'm pretty upset right now, but here's what we need to be able to do. In that example, one person identified what it is that they were feeling. The other person never did. And what happens when we're able to identify emotions, when we're able to say, you know what, I'm actually pretty embarrassed right now, or I'm actually pretty frustrated right now. What we do is, in psychology, we call that creating space. If you can create space between yourself and the emotion, and you can recognize it for what it is, it's actually far more likely that you're going to be able to stop yourself from taking an action due to that emotion. But that all starts with, can you become aware? So one of the very basic exercises that I'll do with an athlete when we're doing this is, I'll have them create 3 columns on a sheet of paper, and I'll say, okay, write down the situation. What was the situation? What was, again, the literal word for word thought in their head? Because again, while thoughts aren't necessarily important, we can use thoughts. If we have the same dominant thought over and over again, generally that's going to lead to the same emotion. So it can kind of be this sort of radar system. So column 1 is situation. Column 2 is what was the literal word for word thought. And then the most important column is what emotion or couple of emotions underpin that thought. And I'll actually do this with athletes, and I'll have them write down 20 situations or, multiple thoughts for one situation. So we'll get 20 to 25 thoughts on a sheet of paper, and then they'll identify emotions. Now, generally the thoughts are all going to be different. Okay. The thoughts are all going to be, you can have 25 different thoughts on a sheet of paper, but then if you go over to the emotion column, you'll start to recognize that it's really 2 or 3 emotions that are popping up. It's like, oh, well, there we go. That's a great way to be able to recognize, wow, fear is really popping up here. I'm having a lot of thoughts, or I'm making a lot of decisions out of fear, or shame is popping up a lot here, or maybe even it's anger. Anger is really driving a lot of my behavior. Well, once we're able to do that, now it becomes a matter of, okay, how do we move ourselves to a place of probably the scariest word in the human language is acceptance? How do we move ourselves to a place where we can accept the fact that we feel a certain way? Because the majority of people that really struggle with their emotions, they're trying to change, ignore, or fight how they feel. Okay. So it's, changing how they feel. They're trying to tell themselves to just be positive, right? You just blew the game in the last second. You get off the ice and grandma comes up and tells you, just be positive, Timmy, just be positive. No, grandma, I'm not going to be positive. I'm upset. I'm allowed to be upset. It's not authentic, right? When we try and change or convince ourselves that we feel something other than what we feel, it doesn't necessarily work. Other people try and ignore how they feel. We try and ignore our emotions. And that's kind of the, don't think of a little blue bunny rabbit, right? If any listener listening to this podcast closes their eyes and I tell them under no circumstances are you to think about a little blue bunny rabbit, every single person's thinking about a little blue bunny rabbit. It's called the ironic effect, right? The brain speaks in images. So if you're sitting there trying to tell yourself, just ignore, just don't be angry, well, it's not going to work either, right? Because now your brain is you're angry, and that because you are. And then the last thing that we do is we try and fight. We try and fight how we feel, or we try and fight in a variety of different forms the thing or the individual that made us feel how it is that we feel. We fight them with words. We fight them, hopefully not with actions, but we try and change, ignore, or fight how we feel, and that just really leads to the emotions grabbing onto us that much more. When in fact, and I guess really the underlying belief there, the underlying mindset there around emotions is a lot of people operate under the assumption that in order for me to do what I need to be able to do or be the person that I need to be able to be in this situation, I need to be without this emotion. I need to find a way to get rid of it. And there's no rule in the rule book of the world that says that's true. Okay? We do things all the time. We're able to take actions all the time if we choose to, in spite of how we feel. And that's really where the secret is. So can we recognize the emotions? Can we create enough space and accept and just allow the emotion to be? Because generally what I tell people is, listen, if you want to feel something else, just wait 10 minutes, right? That's how emotions work. If you allow them to pass, they will pass. But if you take actions or if you try and combat the emotion, well, then now the emotion's got you, right? Now it's going to grab onto you, and it's going to dictate how you think, what you do. So again, we want to be able to raise our awareness. We want to be able to create some space. We want to move ourselves to a place of acceptance. And then the last key is, can we find a way or find a path to a more productive action in the face of that emotion? So, you're at the starting gate about to do a run. There's some fear that pops up, and maybe that fear in the past would dictate, I'm just spitballing here, but maybe that fear in the past would cause you to start, it would dictate your thinking, and it would cause you to, start to, become more future focused in your thinking in terms of, I hope I don't mess up here. I wonder what people are going to think. I really need this score, yada, yada. Well, all that is very unproductive. Whereas let's say that you're on the starting gate and you feel some fear and you recognize, oh, that's that thing. That's that thing of fear that tends to pop up here. Instead of doing all those old actions that I did because I was afraid, what's the most productive action that I can take in the face of that fear? And generally that would be maybe take a deep, calming, centering breath, get your mind back in the moment, and focus on executing your plan. That would be a fundamentally more productive action to take. It just takes practice. It just takes a lot of work and a lot of repetition. But, really what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to position ourselves consistently. We need to be able to position our mind and our body consistently to be able to put it in a place where it can succeed. That's not necessary. That's almost never going to happen if we allow our emotions to determine the actions that we take versus if we allow ourselves to take those actions.
That's such practical advice and a practical tool that anybody can implement, like athlete or not, into their lives, especially that creating that chart, writing all that stuff down. I know I'll definitely be testing it out. So super appreciate you sharing that. I'd love to ask you, like, what got you into this whole field of high performance and sports psychology?
Yeah, I was an athlete in high school, and it certainly got recruited, but quickly realized that I kind of had this. I was a baseball player. I did not have a Division I arm, but I had a brain that could that was a Division I brain, and I could get some money on the academic side of things. And I come from two like very blue collar, very blue collar family in the upper Midwest here. And, with the situation that we were in, it just made a lot more sense for me to kind of exit, the pursuit of sport and take the money on the educational side. And I've always wanted to be close to sport. I think, in reflection, even as like a high school athlete, I probably would have wished that I would have had somebody like myself, because maybe the story would have been a little bit different, or maybe there would have been a few more opportunities there. But I'll be honest with you, I was pre-med for a long time in undergrad, sat in on a Psych 101 course, was really kind of questioning, did I really want to do this? Did I really want to spend 14 years of my life to then, work for somebody else? Truthfully, that was, as transparent as I can be, that was a big driver behind it. Sat in on a Psych 101 course. Absolutely. It just clicked. It made a ton of sense. But I didn't necessarily want to work with the extreme side of mental health, at least not at the time. And I guess in a way, I've kind of backdoored in it to be more on the proactive, resilient side of things. But had a professor, a great mentor of mine, walked into his office, said, "Hey," I literally said, "Hey, this stuff makes a lot of sense." And him knowing me fairly well, he goes, "Well, how do you feel about sports psychology?" No idea what you're talking about. Couldn't tell you. Went home that night. There's a textbook probably an inch and a half thick with all the sports psychology programs, and thumbed through it. And the majority of them were research based. And I'm like, I don't want to be in the lab, man. I want to be working with people. I want to be finding a way to, again, I think there was kind of that natural thing of what led me to pre-med was wanting to be in a position, not to be corny or cliche, but to be in a position to serve others or to help make people make meaningful change. And went through that. University of Denver, in that book, they had a sliding scale of 1 was most applied, 10 was research focused. University of Denver was 1, right? They were going to teach you how to work with athletes, how to work with people, how to help them make, meaningful and impactful change in their life. And I'm like, that's the one. Let's go do that. And that just kind of set me on a journey. And it's kind of one of those where you never really know where you're going to end up. Happy where I did. And then I think you have a variety of experiences from there that kind of, craft, obviously the ones that I've spoken to, kind of steer you towards the work that you're doing now and the work that I'm doing kind of with more of these younger developing athletes. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
yeah, no, that's perfect. I love that. I mean, I took some psychology and a sports psychology class in school. I did all the electives I could, especially I studied marketing and business management, and psychology is such a major point. And it was always something I was passionate about, and I loved those classes. But I just want to, shout you out and appreciate what you do, because I think it's just so important in the world now, like the jobs and the careers that people choose where it's to help other people, especially on the mental side of things. But, with physical side, the health side, mental performance, healing, like that is just so needed in this world now, especially with the way the culture was, and especially with the mental health crisis that athletes are experiencing. So thank you so much for doing what you do, for sharing it on here. And I have 2 questions I end every podcast on, quick questions. So I'll give them to you. The first one is, of all the daily habits that you have, what is that one game changer habit for you?
I read. I have always been a voracious reader. In the middle school that I was in, I'll never forget this. It was a 5th grade reading teacher. And basically the concept of the class, her rules were, you could either do all this like rudimentary, like boring reading work, or just like the essays or whatever it is, or you could read books and you could write like a couple paragraphs on it to prove that you read the books. And I read books. I read those and, wrote the little like blurbs about, basically like the Cliff Notes version of it, wrote the little like 1-page blurbs about the books and never had to do any of the other boring stuff. And I've always been somebody who reads. I think that, it's ironic, the dollar amount that like we spend on education, and there's just so much information that can be housed in a little, $15 to $20 book. So I've always operated under the premise of I never hesitate to buy a book. If there's a book that, even contains one little tip, that one little nugget, one little change that, whether it helps me in my personal life, whether it helps me in my professional life, whether it helps me, physical, mental health, whatever it is, I love to read. So I tend to, I will usually get through about 25 to 30 books a year. And yeah, so that is just the daily thing. It's something I look forward to. But yeah, no, I'm a big reader.
Awesome. No, I love that. Investing in your knowledge and especially advising to people like you said, a $10, $15, $20 book, it can make a big difference. Books, podcasts, courses, YouTube videos, like learning from other people's experiences. It's just so easy now in the world that we live in, and it's so affordable.
I've got one more thing on that, because I think the underlying mindset there is, I've had a lot of mentors, obviously, like in my field, in my industry, but then also on like the business side, because at the end of the day, if you can't run and operate a successful business, it doesn't really matter how great your mission is, or doesn't matter how great your work is, right? There's kind of this adage of you need to be able to make it in order to be able to matter. And one of the best pieces of advice that I've ever gotten is, I think, and this is for really anybody, but we all kind of wonder, how can we be successful? How can we find our path to like this life that we want? And the best piece of advice came from a mentor of mine. He goes, imagine, that you're living across the street from somebody, and maybe they found a level of success in their life, whether it's personally, professionally, whatever it is. And, you'd love to know how your neighbor found their path to that success. Now, the majority of people will spend as much time as they possibly can trying to figure it out, trying to theorize, trying to try a million different strategies, whatever it is. The advice that I got from my mentor is, well, what if you just went over there and knocked on the door and asked him how he did it? That's books, and basically you can find a person's life story, or the culmination of like their life experience in a book. And there's so much good that can come from that. So no, I think that's just kind of like the underlying, it was a really cool piece of advice that I had gotten in my life that I was happy to share.
I love that. And I think that's kind of like the mission of this podcast even is, to get people on here and they're sharing their advice and their knowledge, and it's going to help so many other people who are listening in and could appreciate it. And it helps them all for free, similar to how a book would work. And it's hard to, when you go to school, those people don't have the time to write a whole course, right? Like you're not a full-time professor. You're practicing what you preach. And so coming on here and sharing it is just so helpful for the audience. So thank you again for that. And then the last question that I have is, let's say you're at the end of your life and you're looking back. What is the impact that you wanted to have made over that course of your life?
Oh, that's a good question. I think for me, I would want the impact to be, I take a lot of pride like in the success stories that are on my website. And I've got a freebie for your audience too, before we hop off here, but I take a lot of pride in that, but I never put like the person's name or anything else like that. And there's a really big philosophy for me. Like if you go to my success stories, you'll see like a super nice testimonial, and the individual would be like, if I put their name there, like if I put Natalie Allport's name there, like that would probably be way more impactful than if I just said, Team Canada Snowboarder or whatever it is. But I've always operated under the premise of, my client's success isn't my success. And because it isn't, it's my role in the individuals' lives that I get to work with. My role is I'm that of the guide. I am just merely the resource. It's kind of the Mr. Miyagi versus the Karate Kid example, because, Mr. Miyagi had all the wisdom in the world, but he couldn't paint the fence for the kid. He couldn't paint the fence for the Karate Kid. He couldn't put the wax on and the wax off or carry the water or any of that stuff. The Karate Kid had to do it. And it was the role of Mr. Miyagi to be there, to be the resource, to be the guide, to have kind of the wisdom, to be able to see the bigger picture, but also be able to provide at times the tough love, at times to, just kind of be the person that kind of led them up the mountain. But it's not my climb to make. And so I think for me, and all the athletes that I have been able to positively impact, and all the athletes that I will be able to be able to impact, I think I would love my legacy to be that very few people except those athletes knew that was the relationship that we had, that we were able to do that work together. Because that's the approach that I take. And I think that's what I would like to be I would like that to be my legacy, is I was kind of the quiet person, behind the scenes in the shadows, that got to stand there and watch them go out and, be able to, there's nothing more fulfilling than being able to take a young person who is struggling. For example, I've had a client now that, they've stayed with me for a long, long time. And honestly, he could have exited our work a long time ago. He's good. He's good to go. But I think, there's an aspect of mentorship to it. There's an aspect of kind of that lifelong, kind of client for life type thing with it. But, this was an individual who, you want to talk about somebody who just really struggled with confidence to a point to where wouldn't look you in the eye, didn't want to convey a thought. And I think that he played hockey, and obviously in the very rugged world of hockey, that's not going to go over very well. I think, there are certainly still sports where you kind of gotta have the bravado. You kind of got a little chest puffy to you. You kind of got to be able to get out there and carry yourself a certain way in order to instill the confidence in you that you want your coaches to have. And to be able to take that individual and where he is now, being a USHL player, being a captain of a team, of a USHL team, which is the highest junior hockey league at least in our country. I know there's some great ones in Canada. But to see that transformation, and to see how much his parents are just blown away by the version of himself that he's able to be, that he's been able to become. And again, none of that was me. It was just, that was his work that he was willing and that he was able to do. So it's really cool. I love what I do. I think that probably came out, in this interview.
No, 100%. I was going to say you're very passionate about what you do, clearly, and knowledgeable what you do, and you've really helped the audience. So absolutely love that. Last thing, where can people find you? And I know you mentioned you have a freebie, so I'll make sure to put those things in the show notes, but here's your chance to shout them out too.
Yeah. If there's a parent listening to this, or if there's an athlete listening to this being and listen, I get it. It's hard to find resources, and there's always a cost to it. But if they want a free place to start, I've got a free guide over at my website. So it's Train with Perk. Perk is PERC, not K. So Train with Perk, PERC.com/free guide. It's a little 10-minute read to get through. It contains 3 things that really anybody can use to kind of help them better prepare for that next big moment, that next, we talked a lot about pressure today, that next big pressure filled moment. 3 things that have been kind of the favorites of whether young athletes, older athletes, doesn't really matter. They're easy to install. But yeah, trainwithperk.com/free guide. I think that's a great place to send them. They'll see all my other stuff over there. So
perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on, sharing your knowledge, and just really appreciate all the work that you do.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me, Natalie. It meant a lot. I know it's not a small thing to have somebody come and talk to your people. So no, appreciate the opportunity.